Good afternoon. As a faculty, we are very proud to be able to present our new book, Religious Radicalism, Challenges and Demarcations, authored by our Dean, Professor Johan Timmerman, with contributions of many other prominent authors and professionals in the field. It is our aim to approach religious radicalization from within. The reason for this is a growing lack of understanding of religion, which can be observed in secular policy bodies in the academic world in Europe as well as elsewhere in the world. The collection of articles which makes this book aims at an interdisciplinary approach to religious radicalism. Religious studies blend with theology and cultural criticism within it. The underlying research question, to which the authors present some answers, is what instruments can be used to better understand religious experience and sacred texts in order to combat radicalization. Religious radicalization, challenges and demarcations is divided in two parts. The first part defines and describes the boundaries of religious radicalism. In the second part, biblical and Quranic scholars are challenged by the demarcations which are formulated in the first part. Above all, this book is an invitation to dialogue and at the same time, a question for understanding. The authors are aware that in today's polarized cultural climate, it is a delicate matter to ask for prejudices to be set aside. Shortly stated, radicalism is threatening. However, for those who are completely alien to customs and backgrounds, symbols and behavior, the unprecedented and unfamiliar are just as much of a threat. This form of radicalization, which is rapidly rising on wings of ignorance, also calls for self-criticism. And this book aims to stimulate reflection and dialogue about this problem. Some of the authors that contributed to this book are professors at this faculty. We'd like to welcome Leendert Jan Parlevliet to give us a short introduction on his article, A Plea for Hope, about the contribution of religious education to respectful citizenship.
Good afternoon. Janusz Korczak taught me some important lessons with his classic book, How to Love a Child. He writes, children are the future and look at adults with compassion, because these adults are closer to death. I interpret this thinking as a call to work with children driven by that future, driven by that hope. Korczak has great faith in children. As a doctor, he wrote his observation. As a pedagogue, he is director of the Jewish orphanage in Warsaw. Even when the Nazi occupation begins, he introduces a great deal of democracy. The house is run together with the children and young people. He describes in detail how that works and how well it works. The touching ending of this story has been told many times. When the children and young people were taken away to be murdered, Korczak went with them, while there was an opportunity for him to get away. The hopeful results of this venture live on. His view of children inspires us today. A hopeful story against the background of the most horrific events. Today we present this book on radicalism. I was allowed to write a contribution in it and called it A Plea for Hope. My writing concerns the question of what education can contribute to respectful citizenship. Radicalism, just the word, evokes a harsh world of attacks, demonstrations, violent conflicts, and in response, I can think of nothing but to appeal to soft forces, such as hope. Against the hardness, I put vulnerability in position. The main reason for this is that people are connected by this vulnerability. In connection to education, I've worked out the choice for vulnerability as follows. In ideal circumstances, the school as a mini society can be an excellent training ground for respectful citizenship. To achieve this ideal circumstances, there are a number of conditions. I discuss that in the article. I come to the following appeal in the end of the article. As a school, ensure that you do not deprive children and young people of their hope. That sounds very impractical because the school, in our adult vision, should teach children to harness themselves against this harsh world in which we live. It is naive to want to share in their optimistic view of the future. This attitude that I'm proposing is in line with the shift that is underway in education. The learning of the pupils is more and more placed alongside the teaching of the teachers. This role shifts. There is a lot of experimentation with alternative forms of education in this direction. This shift is particularly powerful in religious education. There, the students' life questions are increasingly taken as the starting point instead of the answers of the teachers. Exploring the world of religion together is increasingly the core of this religious education. Exploring the world together with the children. Seen from this point, the plea for hope is less naive. This week, I saw children in Gaza and in Israel talking to each other about the fear they live in. Children who react in an early adulthood way to what is happening in their lives. At the same time, they were not without hope. I see youth in protest in Belarus and in Hong Kong and so many other places, often naive in our eyes. At the same time, a source of hope. Hope it takes to endure in vulnerability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Parlevliet, for this introduction. We will now welcome Professor Jack MacDonald, who will gladly answer some questions through Zoom. Professor MacDonald.
Hello.
Good afternoon. You wrote your article on Protestant influences on the Dutch East India Company. Yeah. Could you tell us something about how 17th century religion is related to colonial policy?
Well, I could, but it would take me hours, and I've only got a few minutes. So I'll be really brief. And just to say, if you're thinking about what's new in the Bioscoop, look at this film, De Oost, a new film by Jim Taihutu, who I know as a musician, but is also a film director, about the Indonesian War of Independence and the way in which that was covered up in Nederland. And so I think the issue of the East Indies, of Indonesia and colonialism is a very important issue. And traditionally, given this theme in our book of the way in which religion is put to one side, the question I asked myself during a sabbatical, which I spent in Jakarta 2 years ago, was what was the role of Dutch Protestantism in the colonization of Ostindia, of Indonesia? Because the traditional narrative is very well summarized by the dictator of England, Oliver Cromwell, in the 1650s, who said, "The Dutch love gold more than God." And that has fed into the narrative of how, unlike French and Portuguese and Spanish Catholic colonization or British Anglican colonization, the Dutch didn't touch religion in their colonization. It was driven by commerce, and religion was set aside and minimized in order to maximize commerce. And that in various ways, if you take a Max Weber view or whatever view you take, where the religion is sublimated, that's the dominant narrative. And so I looked at some of the very few prominent historians who discuss Indonesia, Nederlands Indonesia, from the point of view of religion. So some, of course, are now dead, Jan de Pata, or the Englishman Charles Boxer, or the three main living scholars would be the Indonesian Protestants, Jan Aritonang, or Yusak Soleman, or the Utrecht scholar, Karel Steenbrink. And they're just some of the very few people who look at how the Dutch in Indonesia did involve religion. And so, being very brief, because I know we're very, very short of time, and also to open a parenthesis for those in the audience who know, I am aware of this spectacular, very good book by D.L. Noorlander, who is American, not Dutch. And so it's called Heaven's Wrath, or as he would say, Heaven's Wrath. And it's all about the West-Indische Compagnie. So this has been done for the West-Indische Compagnie, but not for the Oost-Indische Compagnie, for the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. But if you look at the VOC and its original charter in 1602, there's no mention of religion at all. But in the second charter in 1623, religion and the need for religion in Ostindie is mentioned. What comes in between? What we call in England the Synod of Dort, het Synode van Dordrecht. That comes in between. And we know that at Dordrecht, Ostindie was discussed extensively. In the Proacta, questions from Ostindie are discussed by the fathers in Dordrecht. And in the canons, we have an exposition of true Protestant doctrine, which filters into what's happening in Ostindie. It actively filters, I think, in two ways. What we see in Ostindie with the Dutch is, first of all, an anti-Catholic approach, a Reformation approach in that sense, where the Dutch are trying to replace what the Portuguese and Spaniards had done before them. Also anti-Anglican, because they don't like the Church of England either and are prepared to evict it. And also, maybe even more fundamentally in terms of systematics, it's an approach which privileges sanctification. The Dutch in Ostindie are engaged in a huge enterprise because they are sanctified, because they are elect, because they have pushed to one side any sort of Molinism according to human choices being instrumental in salvation. No, God has already decided, God has already made the Dutch people elect and holy, and what they're doing is holy. And that feeds into the practices of the very controversial fourth Governor General of the VOC, Jan Pieterszoon Koen, who is prepared as a very devout Reformed Christian to go and annihilate and destroy the city of Jakarta in 1619 and on its ashes to build Batavia, who is in 1621 prepared as an extremely good online display at the moment in the Westfries Museum about pala, which is the Indonesian word for Noord Muscat, all about what Koen did in the islands of Banda, in the eastern part of what's now Indonesia, in terms of massacres, where he had no problem at all ethically with that, because he was fulfilling his mission as someone who was of the elect, who was sanctified, who was bringing truth to this part of the world. And so the dead English scholar Charles Boxer describes Kuhn as, and I quote him, a mixture of Calvinism and sadism. And so what I'm trying to do is to pick apart the Calvinism and the sadism and to ask, where is this othering which the Dutch in Ostindie are doing, which is not properly disguised by saying, oh, they're just after money, because they're being informed by what happens in the Synod of Dordrecht. And that is justifying their own behavior to them. And to expose that and to begin to ask the question. So my chapter in the collection is a very, very, very short and compressed aperçu of what I hope will be the VOC companion volume to Norlander. That was too long an answer to your very short question. I'm sorry, Kathleen. I'll be short from now on, I promise.
Okay. And how do you think this research can contribute to contemporary approaches to radicalism?
I'll be brief. All I'll say is this, I'll make just 1 point, 2 points, but very, very, very short. If we are engaged in systematics, if we're talking about fundamental theology, that's wonderful and a very great metaphysical exercise, which feeds into ethics. Our fundamental theology, our metaphysics, our systematics, feeds into our behavior, and we need to be alive to that. There's no point people saying now, oh, well, the famous canons of Dort, the wonderful tulip, my favorite flower, it's a wonderful thing to put on our library shelf. That, if we believe it, feeds into our behavior, and we need to recognize that. And my second very short point is similar. It is, how does our fundamental theology, how does our systematic theology handle difference? What we see, not just with the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and the British, but also with the Dutch, is that they are finding it very difficult in their colonial mentality to handle other people who are different. They find it really difficult. And the thing which makes the VOC different from the West India Company is the existence already in Ostindie of Islam. It's ready-made, highly sophisticated, well-developed religion. And there was instant conflict between the Dutch and Muslims. And how do we in the 21st century handle people who are different from our systematic point of view? That's radical, yeah.
Your research sees religious factors operating everywhere in modern European history. Could you say us a little bit more about this?
This is a very quick defense, thank you for the question, of what we're doing in KU Leuven or Louvain-la-Neuve or ETF or FPTR or FUTP. My PhD was all about how you can't understand the Franse Revolution, the French Revolution, without understanding religion. And too many modern historians just edit out religion and say it's all about social issues or the problems of the monarchy or problems of the rise of the bourgeoisie. No, the French Revolution is in part an exercise in Gallicanism. It's about a French particularism about their own religious identity. And that bubbles all the way through, even with people who you think are atheists like Danton and Robespierre. So I think similarly, in terms of being good students of religion and theology today, we have to look for and see religion almost everywhere. I think most debates that take place in Western Europe today are incomprehensible unless we pay attention to religious factors. And we need people who are fluent in interpreting religious factors, and that's why we're here.
Thank you so much, Professor MacDonald, for this interesting explanation.
Thanks.
We will now continue with Professor Aaron Knop, who will now give a short introduction on his article, The Radical System in the Hebrew Bible.
In the current study of radicalization in society, and Professor MacDonald just ended his speech with this remark, and I start with it, so that's a good transformation. Much attention is paid to the political, social, and biographical backgrounds of people who surrender to radical tendencies. How does it come about that a person becomes radicalized? What factors play a role in this? Religious conviction is often included in this kind of research as a factor between all other factors, but mostly, as I said, only as one of the determining factors. I suspect that many people, and thus also researchers, for we are also people, in our Western society see religion as a kind of side issue, something which you do extra in your life or something like that. One of the many elements that shape a person and make him or he who he or she is. That religion, however, could be central in the formation of a person and could be the driving force behind his or her beliefs is often not perceived. What I want to argue, and further research will have to demonstrate this, is the following. Even though many elements play a role in the process of radicalizing, becoming a radical person, without religious convictions as the supplier of opinions and worldviews, this process would probably not even have started. So radicalization, the motor of radicalization, in my point of view, is religion. We have only begun to think about the role of religion in the radicalization process, but it is certain that its contribution is often underestimated. Again, for many people, religion has become an afterthought or a side idea, and they assume that this is true for everyone, and that is a big mistake. However, for the majority of people on this planet, some form of religion and its associated beliefs are an extremely strong determinant of how they perceive the world around them. When we started the project from our faculty with our South African colleagues, we therefore put forward the principle that religion should take center stage in the debate on radicalism. As theologians, we saw that within religions, and certainly also within our own churches, there is little attention for the role that religion can play in the formation of radical beliefs. If we want to combat radicalism, we will have to penetrate to the heart of religion and examine how belief in a deity, or more generally, belief in a transcendent truth, leads to certain convictions. For people who believe in something, that belief is not an afterthought or a side idea. It's not something you just throw in. For many people, faith and everything which is included with that is an all-important factor in their lives. The rules and attitudes that go with their belief are often seen as absolute and inevitable and also unchangeable. In my contribution to the book, I refer to this as a system of rules and compare it to the image of a block of concrete, a building block. Rules, laws, and views on the world and human relations are often considered within a religion as a God-given system. The rules come, so to speak, from above and are therefore considered unchangeable because they are descending from God himself. After all, if you believe in a God who is ruler of heaven and earth, and this God gives rules to people to follow, it is not evident as a human being to question these rules. Hence, the image of a block of concrete. It indicates a set of laws that comes at a person from outside and which he or she cannot change. Well, that's what he or she thinks. When someone thinks like this, the next step is to implement these rules in society or in his life and defend these rules, this block of concrete, this system, against attacks from other people. When the system of faith, your system of faith, is challenged, you as a believer can resist this challenge and can see it as an attack on the truth. Now, under what conditions this resistance turns into violence is one of the questions we ask in our research. It may be that certain psychological factors are at play in this process of becoming a violent, radical person. Or social factors that determine whether a believer will use violence to defend his or her system. It may also be that the belief system itself calls to be defended violently against attack. So from the system itself, it is asked to defend the system even with violence. When this is the case, it must be recognized and named as such. Only complete honesty and transparency can expose and possibly combat a process of radicalization. The second line of inquiry is the question whether within religions, which by their nature tend towards closedness and absolute certainty, if there are within religions examples of openness and relativism. So that's what we are looking for also. Not only to say there is a system of rules and it's closed and it comes from outside, but also to look for examples from within the religions where people have found a way out of becoming a radical slave of this absolute truth. In my opinion, herein lies a way to combat religious radicalization. In other words, in finding and pointing out ways to relativize divine truth. By this I mean that it may be possible for a believer to reflect himself or herself on the divine rules and to form his own opinion about these rules. In short, to determine for him or herself whether and to which divine laws he or she wants to adhere. But this is not an easy exercise because it is contrary to how truth is established normally within religions. As a truth which lies outside of man and which man cannot or should not change, it is very difficult to reflect upon it as an independent person. However, if there are ways to reflect on that truth within a religion, then openings are created. And where there are openings, there is relativism. And where something can be put into perspective, there is no place for radical thinking. Now I will close almost. In my article, I describe two ways in which there is a kind of, I called it safety valves, built into the Hebrew Bible within the, yes, yet very radical divine system of belief in Adonai, the God of Israel. I point to the fact that the Israelites had the choice to submit to the system, and also that the divine system itself cannot really be known. So there is a system, but actually people cannot know it very well. It's behind another system. I explain that in my article. In that way, I sum it up. In that way, there is a space. There is left a space for people to think for themselves within this whole divine system. An open space, as you will, to reflect and to reflect on the rules and the system. This space for people to reflect on divine truth, and with that I really conclude, is what we are looking for in our project. How can we find space for human thinking within religions, within religious beliefs, and not become slaves to the absolute truth? So it's actually about relativization and self-awareness, and at the same time the preservation of valuable religious traditions, which in our conviction needs not automatically lead to a radical worldview. The Hebrew Bible and rabbinic traditions demonstrate this abundantly.
For our last highlight, we'd like to welcome Professor Elisabeta Kitanovic. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be physically present, but we have pre-recorded the interview. So I will just go ahead and show it to you. Professor Kitanovic, you are the human rights professor at our faculty. Can you explain to us how human rights law is a suitable instrument to combat religious radicalization?
Well, human rights law is a suitable instrument to combat religious radicalization. And to this end, it is necessary to implement human rights in the national legislation. Politicization and instrumentalization of international law stand in the way of this process. To combat inequality and discrimination, the stereotypes surrounding religious communities will have to change. To this end, diversity must be enshrined in legislation. And in reality, it means that, for example, the member states of the United Nations who have committed to the UN International Covenant, for example, on civil and political rights, social, economic, and cultural rights, should have part of their budgets directly with the intention to develop these cultural rights. And this work would help decrease ignorance about the integral identity of religious minorities, or more generally vulnerable groups who should have the right to access cultural goods and services and the fundamental. In order to empower vulnerable groups, it would be important that the integration process works both ways. In other words, that the host country offers a new language and lifestyle, while also showing a readiness to accommodate the diversity of the newcomers and accept their culture and religious habits. And we know many times this is difficult. But this strategy would work on the principle of welcoming the stranger and loving the migrant neighbor, who could be a Jew, Muslim, a vulnerable family member, Roma, or indeed from any other belief or social and ethnic background.
The article you wrote for the book is about human dignity in the process of radicalization. Human dignity is one of the main issues today. Do you think theology and churches can contribute to enhance the awareness of human dignity? And if so, how?
Everybody has human dignity, and this is the key. That is the understanding of those who believe that human beings are created in the image of God. Human dignity does not have a color, nationality, race, ethnicity, sex, age, religion, or belief. Both perpetrator and victim have the same human dignity that no one can take away from them. It might sound surprising, but there is a sense of good in everyone regardless of the sin one may commit. When individuals have negative feelings, such as anger and hatred, they tend to isolate themselves. They also tend to look for answers themselves to heal their soul and realize that internal spiritual pain they're experiencing, which is very difficult to overcome. This kind of frame of mind provides fertile ground for a religious community or political leaders to sow and increase feelings of insecurity in someone and convey the need for justice and revenge. If the community's social, religious, cultural, and linguistic identity is threatened and constantly exposed to humiliation and degradation, the possibility to recruit people from the community into terrorist activities is much higher. Recruits to terrorist groups believe that they will achieve a sense of justice and relief. They believe that despite taking part in terrorist activities, they are walking on the stairs to heaven. They also believe that there will be reward for their martyrdom. Promoting this sort of idea, justifying terrorist acts as an act of serving God, cannot be either theologically or legally justified. From a theological perspective, God has graciously given life to all human beings, and therefore taking life away from anyone is the biggest sin imaginable. Legally, the right to life is protected by the law, and it is founded in Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, as well in the Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
And how does radicalization affect children?
We need to know that children represent the most vulnerable group when it comes to human rights, mostly because they cannot invoke legislation themselves. They can be discriminated against on multiple grounds, for example, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, or belief belonging to a particular ethnic group, speaking a certain language, or coming from a migrant background or living in poverty. Children can face physical and emotional bullying because of such differences, which are often very painful and may cause mental health problems and create long-lasting emotional damage to them, their parents, and their social and religious environment. Child perpetrators usually come from a perceived higher social status or position of power, such as children who are bigger, stronger, or perceived to be popular. Those who feel powerful enough to start abusing other children who usually belong to vulnerable groups, like migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, unstable and poor families, children with disabilities, children experiencing uncertainty about their sexual orientation, or those belonging to a religious community that is different from the majority religious identity in certain educational environment. There are several signs that are common to children perpetrators who bully other children. They can experience a lack of attention at home, have difficulty in finding a place within their own family, being exposed to bullying from their family members, or having difficulties dealing with the complex emotions that they may experience without knowing it. Such situation can lead to a child's deep feelings and anger, and later on can align and be expressed through radical religious ideologies. This can happen due to the need to belong to something more sacred, more just, and with the supposition that one is serving a higher cause. If the child is discriminated against primarily on religious grounds in an early age, such as when he or she belongs to religious minority or migrant minority, and when this is combined with other reasons for discrimination, such as race or language, a child might potentially develop ongoing anger against the majority religious identities of their host country or country of residence, and therefore be a victim of radicalization.
Thank you so much for taking the time to answer some questions, Professor Kizanovic.
Dear colleagues and friends, representatives of the government and the church, dear all at home. To conclude this meeting, I would like to indicate the basic outlines of this book and draw some conclusions. When we started the research project, we had a clear goal in mind. We had one question in mind: how can we understand religious radicalism? One goal. The intention was to use that knowledge of understanding to motivate the public debate and policymakers to address the problems today we know with radicalization, religious radicalization, to address those problems in a constructive way. It has already been said today, our aim was and is to provide knowledge and understanding from within religion, to understand the religious system, to address contemporary problems. Now we can draw the basic lines of this volume, of this book, by connecting a few key points. And I suggest to picture a model, a triangle, with the base at the bottom being modernity, the modern worldview that we have and we know today, with two upright converging lines being one side absolutism, and on the other side self-criticism. So if you want to put the book in one model, I suggest to use the triangle. modernity, absolutism, self-criticism. That's the basic outline of this study. Now, in this model, the basic line implies understanding of religious radicalism as a cultural phenomenon of modernity. The modern worldview started like 500 years ago, the period of the Reformation at the end of the Middle Ages. The modern worldview gave birth not only to science, but also to religion. Religion and science are like twin sisters. Before the Middle Ages, religion was something completely different. It was a whole other perception of what's true. But since 500 years, we live in a growing modernity. And in that worldview, we learn to establish truth by science. Faith has to provide what is good, our lifestyle. That's the modern worldview, modernity. Especially today, the last 3 decennia, with the fading knowledge of traditions, of religion, the question, what is good and what is true, is again high on the agenda. So therefore, in the course of our research, we also listened to voices highlighting the other side of faith and tradition. Religion is supposed to provide the good in society. But is that a fact? South African colleagues show that until deep into the 20th century, Christianity legitimized discrimination through state-preserving violence. In the book, there's a contribution of Ravan Hasanov of Azerbaijan. He shows that a post-Soviet country faced the challenge of including religion and diversity in its constitution. So we learn during our research that both apartheid or Soviet communism show us, they learn us that secular ideologies have also a radical tendency. And religion, like Professor McDonald just showed us, religion is strongly intertwined with those radical secular tendencies, either as legitimation or rejection. So on that basic line, that insight in what is modernity and how it works, the two converging upright sides of our triangular model rises up. On the one hand, like I said, the question, what is absolute? What is truth? Secular materialism relates to religious concepts of reality like water to fire. Does only matter, they say, and the laws that forms and sustains the material world. There's nothing more. The other side, people say no, there's more to reality than matter alone. There's a unity, the conception of coherence. Some call it God, other Allah. There's more than just matter. There's more than only the material world. Underneath those questions, we see at stake is a vision of mankind that is closely linked to nothing less than human dignity. So we can reformulate, and that's what we try to do, we can reformulate the question of truth, what is truth, in an anthropological way. This means, for instance, does man live on bread alone? Or does man not live on bread alone? In other words, is human dignity a financial issue or a spiritual concept? In her contribution, which we just missed because the technological problems didn't let us hear Elisabeta Kitanovic, but in her contribution in the book, she suggests that human rights should be incorporated into civil legislation in every country as a guarantee of human dignity, of the both sides of humankind. She finishes the first part of our volume of our book, the first part of the study, the outlines or demarcations, the triangle. And we can conclude from this first part that religious radicalism is a reaction against illiberal tendencies and injustice in name of freedom and truth. It's a reaction against illiberal tendencies and injustice in the name of freedom and truth. You have to be aware of this concept. So this forms indeed a great challenge, both to politics and to religions, especially those religions that base their meaning of life on sacred texts. These challenges shape the second part of this volume. It is on this side of modernity, the second uprising side of a triangle, on this side of modernity, that the Bible and the Quran get into our perspective. Some scholars in biblical studies, in Quranic studies, they show in this book that sacred texts need a hermeneutic translation if they want to be relevant for today. Both Bible and Quran require explanation. A literal application of those ancient texts today is counterproductive. Discourse reading is the key. This means that we pay attention to and have knowledge of the discourse, the underlying storyline, the context. We must recognize, as institutions, as scholars, as churches, we must recognize that also sacred texts are the result of social and political changes. In order to do so, it is essential that we learn and practice the art of self-criticism. Secular and religious institutions should integrate the art of self-criticism in their attitude. So that's where, on that key point in our study, that's where the two sides of the triangle meet. Namely, the point where you dare to question the common sense of yourself. How do I see the world? How do I see the other? Dare to question that point, and of tradition. How did they see it? For science, this means openness to the unknowable. We don't know everything. Science has to be introspective on that part. Openness to the unknowable. For religion, it means the quality of seeing that truth is constantly changing. Listening. Listening, right? Collega Parolin in his concluding essay, is therefore a twofold way of communication. Listening. Listening to the other. You hear what the other says. At the same time, you make an appeal to your own self-awareness. I think in this way, you can understand and provide some tools to tackle religious radicalism. So finally, our research on demarcations and challenges of religious radicalization calls for teaching knowledge of religious traditions in order, not in function of the institution, but in order to strengthen identity and empower individuals. That must be our goal. At the same time, in this study, we ask for the necessary dose of self-criticism. This applies equally to policymakers and religious leaders. It is not constructive to repeatedly underline one's own secular or religious rightness, but rather we suggest to look for a broader concept of humanity by listening to the other and appeal to your self-awareness. That's, I think, in short notice, the basic outlines of this study. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Stemmerman. As we have heard, many factors contribute to religious radicalism, and it is therefore important to be aware of these factors, demarcations, and challenges in order to understand and work together in our fight against religious radicalism. As a conclusion to this presentation, we will present a copy of the book to the chairman of the board of the FPTR. The representative of the Flemish government, and the representative of the United Protestant Church of Belgium. We'd also like to take this time to thank all authors present, as well as Professor Stemmerman, and of course, everyone present here and virtually to attend this book presentation. For those present here at the faculty, we would like to invite you to a small reception, which will be held in the back. Those who attended virtually, we thank you again for your presence. If you would like to order the book, it is available through our website or through the publisher's website. And further on, we wish you all a wonderful evening ahead. Thank you very much.